Any one lifetime is not that big of a deal because there's always a do-over.
Welcome to Soul Guide with Vandy Lozano, a show about past lives, life between lives, and this life.
Hello, everybody. Today we have a very special guest, Brian Smith of Grief to Growth podcast. Oh, and I forgot to say hi. I'm Vandy Lozano, and we have our very special guest today, Brian Smith. And those were his words from his session, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. So Brian is a life purpose coach, a grief guide, and he also does small business consulting. And his mission is helping people rediscover who they are and why they're here. So I am going to bring Brian into the screen. Hey, Brian, how are you doing today?
Good, Vandy. Good to see you.
Great to have you here with us. So thank you so much for joining us today. So I wanted to start with just a little bit of your background. So if you could, so the way I was thinking is we'd talk a little bit about your story, how that brought you to the podcast that you're doing and the work you're doing today. And then a little bit about your sessions at the end. I actually went through them yesterday, so they're very fresh for me. It's kind of fun.
Good.
But starting with your story, can you tell us just a little bit about where you're from? And I know religion or toxic religion, as you refer to it, is part of your story. So anything you'd like to share about that?
Sure. In a nutshell, started off, I grew up in a very fundamentalist Christian home, which I would refer to now as toxic religion, with a fear of God, a fear of judgment, and I had a fear of death. It's called thanatophobia. I had a severe fear of death for most of my life, actually, which culminated around, it was in my late 30s, early 40s, and I ended up actually in therapy because of that, because I just could not get over this fear of this God that was judging me all the time. And so what's interesting, around that time, I started really studying the afterlife pretty intensely. Started reading books about mediumship, about near-death experiences, anything I get my hands on, because my background is I'm a chemical engineer, so I'm very analytical.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't just go on what people said. Just taking things on faith didn't work for me. I needed to know, so I did a really intense study and really got over my fear of death for the most part. But then 7 years ago, this past June, it's June 24th, 2015, my 15-year-old daughter, Shayna, suddenly passed away. And this is Shayna in the picture behind me for anybody watching. She was healthy. She was an incredible athlete. She was a great scholar. She was going into her sophomore year of high school, and had come back from a volleyball tournament, and she was sleeping in her bed in our house, and just we went to wake her up the next morning, and she didn't wake up. So it was an extremely sudden transition. The good thing is, because I had studied so much about the afterlife, I never feared for Shayna. But it put me it rocked my world, of course. It completely changed my life and put me on a course of really, intensely studying this even more than I was before. So that was 7 years ago. About 4 years ago, a friend of mine came to me and said, "There's this life coaching course you should take." And the reason why I mentioned this part of the story is I believe things in our life are kind of guided. This was totally out of the blue. Now, this person isn't intuitive, but I was like, why would you tell me about a life coaching course? I've never mentioned I wanted to be a life coach. I have been volunteering with helping parents heal for the last few years before that. So I was helping a lot of parents go through losing a child. But I took the course and decided about a year after that to start my life coaching business, primarily helping people go through grief, helping people understand how to make how to make sense out of something that doesn't make a lot of sense to most people. So I've been doing that for the last 3 years or so. Started the Grief to Growth podcast, wrote a short book to help people understand what the early stages of grief are like. And I kind of feel like what my life mission now is, trying to help people get through this life and put it all in perspective.
Wow. Quite a story. And I can't even imagine what it'd be like to lose a child. I think when I was on your podcast, we talked about what opened the door for me with all this was losing my dog. And you were very gracious and said, loss is loss. But I felt like it prepared me for the loss of my mom. My mom was disabled, and it was a really complicated grief.
Mm-hmm.
But I love when you share that. I was listening to some of your podcasts recently, that things don't happen to us, they happen for us. And if you could say a little bit more about kind of that message, as well as you shared that Shayna gave you a lot of visions and messages, which also helped with and kind of helped with your shift.
Yeah, well, that is a complete shift for me because even growing up in the faith I grew up in, it was kind of like there was this God that was always watching over you. And people would say have faith in God, which I never really understood what that meant because I knew that bad things still happen to good
Right.
people.
Right.
And I knew a guy when I was in my teens and he was in his mid-20s and got brain cancer and passed away. And this was a guy in the
Mm.
church. And I'm like, wow, why did that happen? My grandfather, when he passed away, I was taught that death was a result of sin. When my grandfather was a pastor, he was like the most righteous man I could think of.
Mhm.
And so I was like, this idea that if we do the right thing, it's going to protect us doesn't really work. I mean, I could
Yeah.
look around the world and see that bad things do happen. So I just went around fearing all the time something quote bad was going to happen to me. Now, again, this has been almost 7 years since Shayna's passed. So this been a change that's happened over the course of a long period of time. But I realize now I don't think that anything really truly bad happens. I know that's a bold statement, but
Mhm.
everything's a matter of perspective and everything's a
Mhm.
matter of, the way that we look at things. And there's a silver lining or blessing in everything that happens to us. And I believe I've come to the point now where I've evolved to the point where I think that the universe is actually conspiring for us, and not just us individually, but us collectively. And everything that happens kind of weaves together a tapestry that's leading to an ultimate greater good for everybody and for everything. Now that is a matter of faith, but if you look back through your life, and I'll be 61 in a few weeks,
Me too.
um, you can start to see these things work out, and you can see how things in your life work out, how the worst things that happen to you, like the loss of a job or divorce, or I know someone that had a couple of house fires. And we can
Mhm.
see though how they actually weave in and actually change us and mold us and propel us forward. So that is a belief that I strongly hold now. And it really helps me. So when something does happen to me, instead of me thinking, why this happened to me, why this terrible thing happened to me, I think like, what's the lesson in this? What can I do with it? How can I take this and make it into something better?
It's interesting, and I'm trying to look at the camera so you see I'm looking at you. It's hard because I want to look at your face, but in your sessions, and Brian has given me permission to share about his sessions. One of the statements you said was, "There is no good or bad; it's only experiences."
Yeah, and I know that's something that again, it's funny because these are fairly I hate to use the word advanced concepts, but these are concepts you have to chew on for a while.
Hmm.
They make no sense on the surface. You would say, well, of course it's bad. I'll just say a real quick version of the story because it's one of my favorite stories. It's my favorite story about a farmer who finds a wild stallion. And so he finds a wild stallion, and everybody says it's a great thing you found this wild stallion. Then his son tries to break the stallion, and he falls off and he breaks his leg. So everybody says this is a bad thing. The next day, the army's coming through town, conscripting people into the army, and his son can't go because he's broken his leg. And everybody
Right,
says, "Oh, this is a good thing."
right,
So the point is, you don't really know how things are going to play out. So when I
right,
say there's no good or no or bad, that's one way of it. That's one way of looking at it. But the other thing is, it's again, it's how we choose to perceive things. So with the passing of my daughter, this is an extreme example, right? Someone would say,
sure,
well, there's nothing good that ever comes out of anyone's death, especially of a
right,
child.
right,
But there have been blessings that have come out of that, out of her
mm,
passing. And because I know that she's not gone, because I know that she did not
right,
cease to exist,
right,
from her perspective, it's all good.
right.
So it's just really a matter of how you look at it.
Yeah, yeah. There's David Kessler, the grief expert. I think we've talked about him. He says one of the things he says with grief that can be helpful is to remember, where are they and when are they? Because we're still grieving the way they passed or the things that they missed or the trauma. And he reminds us, where are they right now? Shayna right now is with you and also in spirit, or I don't know the words you would use, but
Mhm.
when are they and where are they, I think can be really helpful. Did you want to share any of the messages, if that's not too personal, or visions that you did receive with her transition?
Well, I mean, I've had so many signs. If you're talking about signs since she's passed,
Yeah.
I mean, they happen all the time. I mean, just last week, I walk every morning. I was walking and I do this like a little meditation thing that toward the end of my walk. So I was kind of meditating and I saw a cardinal fly in front of me.
Mm,
And a lot of people take of cardinals as symbols or signs. Now, I'm a very rational person. I'm an engineer. I live in Ohio, so I'm like, it's a cardinal. Could it may or may not be a sign. My wife sees cardinals. She says it's a sign. I'm like, I don't know. But the cardinal just flies across, and they fly at a very distinctive pattern. So it flies across, and
mhm.
I'm thinking about Shayna, thinking maybe that's a sign. Nah, it's probably not. Then, like a second later, a finch comes flying across the other way. Now, finches are these little tiny
Yeah, yeah,
birds. They're
yeah.
about this big. They're yellow. They are very uncommon here. And
Right.
it lands. I'm walking on one side of the road. It lands across the road. It's a small road across me in the grass, and I walk over to get a picture of it, and it just kind of sits there. So I
Mhm,
actually get my phone out and I start filming it. And
mhm.
I'm like, okay, now I think this is a sign. It's about the
Right.
synchronicity, the timing of it. Um, a week before that, I was out walking. When I walk, I'm in kind of this meditative state, and
Mhm,
I look down, and I see two dimes on the ground. And when
mm,
Shayna passed, I said, dimes are going to be our sign. So
okay.
if I find a quarter or a penny or a nickel, that's fine. But I want something specific, dimes. So there are two just laying there in the sidewalk right together.
Mhm,
So again, I'm thinking, okay, well maybe it's a sign I haven't find a dime in a long time. I get home, I get on Facebook, a Facebook memory comes up from exactly 4 years ago. And it's the day that my wife and I found 77 cents
oh,
in the
wow.
pocket on a bus that we're riding on. And 77 was a sign from her father because he was 77 when he passed.
Mm,
So the finding of the two dimes at the same time that the
yeah,
memory came up, I take as a sign. And there's just, so many signs
yeah.
like that I've gotten from her in the course of the last almost 7 years.
Yeah, yeah. I was sharing, and I think it was last week or the week before, after death communication was the topic. And with my mom, it was peacocks. And so,
Mm,
yeah,
mhm.
okay. Well, and I also want to comment on, you said something about it's not just for our benefit, it's for the collective good. And again, in listening to your sessions this week, or kind of listening through them, most people come into this life for, and this is probably going to embarrass you a little bit because you're a pretty modest guy, to develop their own soul and to take that back to the other side. And you and your soul group, I don't know how much you remember, because I know when I had mine, it's a little underwater kind of. You
Mhm,
remember the
it
big
is.
points, but not all the details.
Right.
But yours was, your soul group chose the hard lives, and you all incarnated for the collective raising of consciousness, were the words.
Yeah, and I believe that that's true. There's a woman I have to give her credit. Her name is Frances Key. She wrote a series of book called The Team, and reading those books really changed my perspective because we typically think of ourselves as like, as you said, we come in for our own soul growth, and that's
Mhm.
part of it. But we don't exist as individuals. We exist as groups, as soul groups, as teams, as families, whatever term you want to use. So when we're trying to make sense of things, like someone passing at a very early age, it's not necessarily for that person's benefit. It might be for the benefit of someone else on the team.
Right, right.
So that's the way I tend to look at things now. So we're like fingers on a hand is one analogy people use. We're like cells in a body. We are not as individuated as we believe that we are.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you said that. I had a session just last week. I'm hoping I can get their permission to share some more specifics. But the general gist of it is, when they passed over, it wasn't the way it usually goes at the end of their past life session. And I said, "You're one of these beings that they were experiencing." And they said, "No, I'm not one of, I'm part of." And that
Hmm.
was like a big shift for me. I've never heard it worded quite like that. And in
Hmm.
the life, that was the same experience, which, like I said, I think I need to get more before I say a lot of specifics, but just out of respect for that person. But just, I'm not one of, I'm part of. And I've noticed with more advanced souls, they actually speak as we and less as I.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I agree with what you're
A
saying
lot of
completely.
times, if you hear people that channel the
Mhm.
beings or the entities that they channel are not a single being. They're a group
Right.
that their consciousness is so close that they identify as one, and that's I believe how we are. It's one of those things. It's paradoxical.
Hmm.
It's kind of like in Star. I love Star Trek because there's so many great
Hmm.
analogies. But the Borg, that we're all part of a collective. So everything
Hmm.
that we do, every experience that we go through, It's not just for us, but it's also shared by the collective,
Right. I
which is a
agree.
really powerful concept.
Right. We take that learning back to the other side. And
Yeah.
people say, well, why do we need to bring that back to God? We'll call it, isn't God complete? Because I grew up in a conservative Christian background too, but apparently not, that the collective, divine, collective, all of us, there's growth. We were going to say something though. Go ahead.
No, I think it's really important because we were taught to believe that God is complete, God is sufficient, God doesn't need anything, all those types of things.
Mhm.
But again, it's one of those things that's self-contradicting, because if God is complete and God doesn't need anything, then why did God create mankind? I mean, obviously, God does want to have that relationship.
Mhm. Right.
So the Christian faith, just like other faiths, kind of points to the truth, but it's not the entire truth. And there is something about consciousness, about the universe, whatever you want to call it, that is evolving, that is developing, that wants to have these experiences. You can call it a game. We kind of play this game. We come in, we
Mhm.
forget who we are for the
Mhm.
time that we're here, and then we try to remember. It's kind of like a game of hide and seek.
Right. Right. And it's funny you said game, because again, in your life between live session, you said this. In fact, yours was the statement that I was quoting at the beginning. That was from your session when I
Mm.
said, um, any individual life is not that big of a deal because there's always a do-over. And you said it's like a avatar in a video game, and you just hit reset and go again.
Well, and that reminds me of my daughter, because we loved playing Mario Brothers, this video game where we had these little
Mhm.
avatars you run around, and Shayna loved to pick people up and throw them into the lava. And we would get so angry at Shayna for throwing people in the lava. But I still think about that to this day, because
Mhm.
the character doesn't die. There's no end to the
Right.
character. That just regenerates. And
Right.
I think from the spirit world, when we were looking at things, we don't see death as a tragedy.
Mhm.
It's just part of the game. It's just part of the design.
Yeah. I've heard people describe it like taking off a set of clothes and then,
Mhm.
moving forward. Okay. I want to look and see. I have a little bit of notes here. If there was anything else I wanted to ask you about grief to growth, I guess just about the podcast, I jotted down some of the sayings: for us, not to us, planted, not buried, surviving to thriving. Those were some of the catchphrases. Do you want to say anything more about those? Otherwise, I wanted to shift to your sessions, but take your time.
Yeah, well, I do want to say something about that, because that's what grief to growth is about. People will ask me, like, how do you work with people? And I always are quick to tell people, I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm not a certified counselor. I'm someone to help people kind of shift perspective.
Mm.
Like, like, every event that happens is multiple stories you can tell, and those stories are equally true. So we get to decide which story we want to go with, and which story we want to focus on, which way we want to concentrate. So if I look at my life, as I said, it's a temporary thing. It's
Mhm.
I'm here for a little while. It's
Mhm.
planned. It's everything's going to be okay. There's nothing, you know, uh, nothing permanent can happen to me that's really bad. So that's the emphasis that I put in the work that I do with people, is helping people make that shift from, oh, this is terrible, I'm never going to be the same, to, it's right, you're never going to be the same. You're going to be even better. And let's how do we get there?
Right. And I love that you said, because on my website, we talk about discovering who you are and why you're here. And you said rediscovering. So it's kind of like getting people to remember who they actually
It's all
are.
about remembering. We know we know when we come in.
Right.
But we there. I love the analogy. We drink from the river of forgetfulness. We
Yeah.
we we
Yeah.
say, okay, right before you come in,
Right.
okay, here comes the veil.
Right. Right.
And the
Right.
veil is actually, I love this analogy. The veil is actually the body. So we think about the veil
Mm,
being something external. It's
okay.
actually our brain. It's the filters that we bring in with us.
Wow. Wow. Well, and some young children still have memories.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think all
Absolutely.
young children do, at least till they're when they're pre-verbal, and then and there's been some really cool stories. I think of one the other day. This kid's like looking at his little brother, and he's whispering to him, and the mother says, "What are you doing?" She says, "I'm trying to ask him how to talk to God, because I'm starting to forget."
Wow. Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, and did you want to say anything about planted, not buried? Because I know that's a big part of Grief to Growth, the podcast.
It is. I think as I was raised Christian, I don't identify as Christian anymore, but I'm still a big fan of Jesus, and I love the saying when Jesus talks about it. He said, "Except a seed fall to the ground, it remains
Right.
alone. But if it falls to the ground and it dies, it produces fruit. It becomes many." So when
Mm,
we go through a grief event, we feel
mm,
like we've been buried. We feel like that's it.
right.
This is over.
Right.
I'm never going to see the sun again. I'm never going to be the same. But that can be an action event where you're actually planted, where you
Yeah.
become nurtured and you can actually grow into something that's even better, and something and do things that you would not have done if it hadn't been for that grief event. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
why I chose that phrase.
Yeah. No, I love that. Okay. So I see questions coming in. So I'm just going to glance over before we shift over to talking a little bit more about your sessions. Um, let's see. Oh, I think it's mostly people just saying hello. Hi, Nikki. Hi, Kimberly Lozano. That's my dad's wife. Hi, Henry. That's my husband. Um, okay, so I mostly see we do have people watching, but no questions yet. Just mostly everybody checking in. So thank you, everyone, for being here and joining us, and with our very first and very special guest, Brian. All right. So, do you feel like talking about your sessions a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. So, do you remember you had a past life session and then a past life plus life between life session is the second one? Do you remember much about the first past life session, or do you want me to jog your memory a bit?
Well, I do want to say something, because I'm glad you said it. When you do these sessions, it's you're like kind of in a dreamlike state.
Mm,
So I remember some of it, but
mm.
I don't remember details. So
Okay.
I remember kind of like highlights.
Okay. And it's funny because I thought I remembered them pretty well. And then when I didn't listen to the whole thing, but I kind of skipped around through them, I was like, oh, yeah. And then it kind of came back. And I think that's what will happen for you. So the first one, you emerged as, I think, a child in the Middle East in the
Hmm.
marketplace.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the name, is it okay if I say the names?
Yeah,
The name was, I think it was Vikram. Am I saying that right? Does that
yeah, I
sound
think it
familiar?
was. Hmm.
Okay. And it was 1875. And then there was a tragic event where you lost your father. Do you remember that?
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
Uh-huh. Around age 13. And then took over the business. And so I'll go through it and say who is the most important person in the life? What was a happy or proud moment? And do you want me to remind you some of those, or do you remember any of those?
Yeah, yeah. You can go ahead and remind me. That'd be great.
Okay. Well, like I said, I don't think I would remember mine. It's easier because I go under a little bit when I do the sessions, but I don't go under obviously as much as you. So you took over the business when
Yeah.
the father passed, and then you were successful. And I think that was one of the questions for this session was, will I ever feel successful?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then you were quite successful and felt a happy or proud moment was your daughter's wedding.
Hmm.
Do you remember much about that?
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that was the case. Yes.
And then and the most important person was your mom. I think you took
Hmm.
care of the family. I don't know that you had your own family. I feel like you were mostly taking care of the family you grew up in. Oh, no, wait, you did have your family because you had your
Yeah.
daughter.
Yeah.
And then the thing that stood out to me was when you crossed over, there was and I haven't seen this before. Each session teaches me a little bit. Um, there was a huge welcoming home when you crossed over. Like it wasn't just one person. Usually it's somebody's guide. And I think we did meet your guide, but initially it was like everybody you've ever loved was
Yes.
there.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then some of the messages were, I'm going to look at my notes here. Be who you are and choose a path. Because you were kind of trying to make some decisions turning 60 and career path
Right.
and it was and do you remember which path they were telling you to nudging you toward?
I believe it's what it was the grief stuff that I'm doing now. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
don't mean to put you on the spot. Like I said, it's all fresh for me because I just listened to it. But
Yeah. Well, as I remember the highlights that you went over. And as I think about it, I can recall the images that I got when I went through it. So yes, it definitely it made an impact, and it really did help me.
yeah. And was there anything in particular that stood out to you, or how was it? I remember you weren't even sure it would work for you.
No, I wasn't. The thing is, because the whole idea of hypnosis, and then you and I talked about this, is
Right,
like,
right,
I'm again a very rational, analytical person.
right,
I'm
right.
like, I'm not going to be able to let go enough to go
Mhm,
into this state um, that wherever it would take. And it's weird because I do remember it, but it is kind of very dreamlike. And when I was in it, I knew what I was saying, but I was kind of listening to myself as I was saying it at the same time.
mhm. Yeah, exactly. Okay. I have to confess, I'm already starting to think about the next one. Are you up for number 2?
Sure.
That one was a little more intense. So in this one, why don't you tell me the highlights you remember, and then I'll fill in if there's anything else.
Well, I remember I was the woman in that one,
Mhm,
and that my I was a white woman in the South,
mhm,
and my daughter was a slave, Shayna, and we owned her, and she was sold when I was like a teenager,
mhm.
and it really impacted me in terms of realizing how wrong slavery was.
Right.
So then I ended up falling out with the family and deciding to become basically an abolitionist.
Mhm.
So yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. Yeah. I think I don't know which was more shocking, when you were a plantation owner daughter, or when you and or the relief maybe of just when you found out you went on to be an abolitionist. Because I think initially, and a girl, it's always, I think, a shock when we're a different gender. Was that a surprise for you?
Um, yeah, really not so much. No, no.
Okay. So just to kind of explain things to our listeners a little bit and our viewers, um, Brian emerged in, let me look, I have the dates written down, 1840 Georgia, 16 years old on a plantation. And a significant event was the slave who was a servant to him or her in that life. Amy was the name. Did you remember the name? I didn't remember till I listened. The servant, who was also his friend or Amy's friend, was being sold. And then later on in the Life Between Lives, the next part of the session, we found out that that was Shayna, that
Right.
Shayna was that girl. Her name was Joanne in that life.
Yeah, that's I had forgotten that name. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Like I said, I cheated. I went through the sessions again. Um, and that Okay, let me back up a little bit. So, and that at age 25, you were in the North. You said it felt like Pennsylvania, and that's kind of how it works. Is Brian said, "Well, I feel like it's Pennsylvania." You feel like you're just making these things up, but there's a reason you feel like it's Pennsylvania and not Hawaii.
Yeah.
This feels right. And then, do you remember who? Well, I shouldn't ask you if I'm putting you on the spot. I will just say you met somebody really important in that life. That was the most important person, Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, that was weird. Yes.
What was that like?
Um, well, that was yeah, because that again, that's one of those things where you feel like you're making it up, to be
Mhm,
really frank about it. But
mhm.
you know, if I went with what I was feeling, that's what I was feeling. That I had met Frederick Douglass, and I had always wondered if I had done enough. Um,
Right, right.
so that was the kind of thing in that life. It's like, did I do enough to stop this terrible thing?
Yeah, yeah, and that's a theme when we get to your counsel, of feeling like you haven't done enough, and them saying there are limitations when you're working with humans. Like, you can only raise consciousness so much in a single life. And they kept telling you glass half full, focus on what you've done,
Yeah,
but you take the hard life. So, and then the last thing I wrote about that life was, um, the turning point was when the slaves were free.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. Like I said, it was an amazing experience because I had no idea I was going to go. Yeah, I was nervous about it, but
Mhm.
it's very interesting the insights that came of it, and again, it makes you realize when you if you really, because someone asked me the other day, they said, "Do you really believe in this? Do you really believe in reincarnation? Do you really believe in this?" I'm like, and it's that experience, and it's the experience from near death experiences and so
Mhm.
much more. And the thing is, I deal with a lot of people who are fundamentalist Christians, and you're like, it's not in the Bible. Well, there actually is reincarnation
It
in the
is in the
Bible,
Bible. Yeah.
even
Yeah.
though they tried to strip it out. But most faiths in the world do believe in reincarnation. Most people in
Yeah.
the world, for most of the history of mankind, have believed in it, and it makes a lot of sense. So I absolutely do.
Yeah, yeah, me too. In fact, I'll talk more about this at the end, but we have someone coming on in a couple weeks who it's the first time I've had somebody do this. He wanted a little more facts. He wanted to be able to look stuff up afterwards. So we just drilled down a little more into names of places and ages and things. And afterwards, he looked it up and he found a castle with the name of the town he got in the session. And during the time that he had the past life, the person in the castle had the name that he had.
Wow.
Yeah. And then there's even more. Like he saw rooms and places that he recognized. And I've had other people where it's rare that I have kind of famous lives, but every now and then they happen. People who are notable and are written up about. And oftentimes they'll be like, oh my gosh, that's the uniform I was wearing in the Prussian War with the little tassel, or that's the stable where the horse I rode when I was this royal person. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I don't usually people are doing them for more spiritual reasons. This was the first, not that it wasn't spiritual, but it was the first time someone was so analytical that they wanted to be able to research it afterwards.
Yeah.
Was pretty amazing. Okay, so moving over to your counsel, I again jotted down a few notes, but was there anything in particular that you remember or that stood out, or any messages that you remember that were
I don't
important
remember
to
that
you?
part very well.
Okay. And again, it gets kind of hazy, but you know how you said you like Star Trek?
Yeah.
You said they were wearing Star Trek uniforms,
Okay.
Star Trek type uniforms. And something else really notable is the guide. Oh, and you know what? I'm seeing a private chat message. So let me flip over here really quick. Oh, someone said they have a question. Let me see. Let me come back to that in a second. But my assistant, thank you, Leticia, was letting me know someone was asking something. But oh, every session I've ever done, and pretty much all the LBL people that I know, the director of the council will say, is there one person that will be a chair or moderator of this meeting? It's almost always a male. And yours was a female director.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really powerful. But let me jump over and see. This was back to your coaching. So I'm going to back up for just a little minute before we do more of your session. Sarah Keene asks, and hi, Sarah. Hi, Brian. How do you feel this experience changed your life, views, and coaching? I think she's talking about the past life experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Sarah, it's just more evidence, on top of other evidence. And I'm going to go back to something that Vondi said, the person that said, I want to be able to analyze this. And I've done a lot of studying into this stuff, in addition to session. It's people have had veridical experiences where they can go back and have a name or a date or something. I didn't feel like I needed that. And again, I come from that background because I am an engineer and I want to know how things work. I'm to the point now where it's like, okay, I don't need that anymore. So what it did is it reinforced my very strong belief that this is not the only life, that this life is not unguided, that this life is not random, and that it's only temporary. Where there's saying I always say I can do anything for 30 seconds. It comes from a really intense exercise program I used to do, and the coach would say I can do anything for 30 seconds. So I look at this life as it's just a short period of time. So what this experience did, as I said, it just reinforced that belief that when people say to me, the thing that breaks my heart more than anything, because I work mostly with parents who have lost children, I will never see them again. And I hate that phrase because you will see them again, and even though I'm Shayna, in my past lives, I lost Shayna when I was in the one life, and I've lost Shayna in this life again, but I will see her again. We've done this before and we'll do it again. So it doesn't minimize. I don't mean to minimize anything that anybody's going through, because the pain that we suffer here is very real, but it's only for a short time. So that's what it means to me.
Yeah, thank you. You said something in your sessions that was really powerful to me. Rounding third. Do you remember this?
Mm-hmm.
Headed for home. Do
Mm-hmm.
you want to say a little bit about that? I know that's really personal.
No, there was a baseball guy here. I live in Cincinnati, and his famous phrase was "rounding third, headed for home." In fact, there's a restaurant downtown that has a plaque up that says "rounding third, headed for home." Lonnie and I are about the same age. I shouldn't tell a woman's age, but
No, I already did. I said my birthday's coming up
so
too.
I'm 60 now. I'll be 61 in a couple of weeks, and I feel like I'm rounding third and headed for home. Now, when we're not talking to people that believe in prior lives or past lives, that can sound morbid to people. They think, "Oh,
Mm,
I only have one life. I need to live full out while I'm here." And I encourage everybody to live full out while you're here.
right,
Live like this is the
right,
only life you have. But when I tell people I'm looking forward to going home, it's because I know that it's home. I know that this is not my home. And everybody that I love here, I'll miss them for a while when I leave, but we'll be together again. So that's the way I view life now. I was telling someone the other day, I was talking to a mother who had lost a son, and I said, "This is a win-win for me. If I'm here in the body, as Paul said, Paul said I'm still with the Lord. But if I'm in the body, I'm with my wife and my daughter that are still here. But
right.
if I leave the body, I'm with Shayna. So either way, I'm good."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and one of the things we learn in Life Between Lives is we don't bring all of our energy, all of our self, I guess, to any given life. So in your soul group, your wife and your daughter were there.
Right.
So that they're there, they're in both places. But yeah, it obviously in different ways.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept too. Is that we are mostly there even when we're here.
Mhm.
So in a sense, we've all, and I'm still with Shayna there, but I can't
Right.
perceive that while I'm behind the veil.
Right. Right. Well, in yours, again, this was the really fascinating. I've heard this before, but yours was the first where I saw it, or when you described it to me. Was Do you remember that in your soul group? And for those of you who are newish to this, there's different places we go on the other side in the Life Between Lives session, and there's predictable places like your soul group and your council, and then there's other places too. But the soul group is usually your loved ones that you incarnate with over and over. But in your soul group, your other past life selves were there. Do you remember
Yeah.
that? And
Hmm.
you said, and in fact, they're not past lives because all the lives are happening simultaneously, which I've heard people say before, but it's like my brain can't like take all that in.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's paradoxical and it goes against our brain. But again, science, I love science. Science tells us that time is an illusion and that everything is actually happening at once, that time is relative. So as we move, we change the flow of time. So if you think about it, if you're in spirit and you can move at infinite speed, then you could actually travel through time. So I think from spirit perspective, it's something that we can't really understand with our little tiny brains.
Yeah, we call
But
it
what it
now time. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, it's called now time. But I know a woman that was writing about past lives, and she actually said, "I've seen future lives," and people think, well, the future hasn't happened yet. But from a spirit perspective, the
Right.
future is happening now.
Right.
So we only perceive this as the present because this is the moment that we're in, and we think the past has already happened, the future is yet to happen, but it's actually
Right.
all at the same time.
Right. Which I can't understand, but I agree with.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yours was the first where they all showed up in your group.
Yeah,
Your
and
past
yeah,
lives.
I think that's the way that it is because we do. There's a concept I call the oversoul. So it's like there's a we're all it's like we're like Russian nesting dolls. So there's a
Mhm.
big piece of us that splits off pieces of itself that incarnates. So I don't think I will ever incarnate again. There will never be another incarnation as me as Brian,
Right.
but I'm a part of this thing that incarnated as Brian this time and incarnated as Amy before and will incarnate as Samantha next time.
Right. Well, in fact, one of the questions we ask is what part of you is sort of retained from life to life? In fact, that was the thing that was the most interesting, or one of the things that stood out to me with the Life Between Lives is that, as my medium teacher used to say, it's not all angels and fairy dust over there. Like we have actual personalities, and part of that is retained from life to life, even though we'll be different, and we choose each life and each body for a specific reason.
Hmm. I truly believe that. Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to look and see a little bit more about your council, or actually, before I move on, your soul group. In Life Between Lives, Michael Newton talks about different colors for different levels of advancement, and Shayna was purple.
Mhm.
And the deepest, darkest colors are the most advanced souls, with I think purple being the highest, purple or blue. It starts out like white all the way up to the darkest, darkest color except black. And I don't think it goes to black. So I thought that was interesting. And also, she was your primary soulmate. Do you remember that?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, we've always identified purple as Shayna. In fact, it's funny because before she was born, I painted her room purple, and it's still purple.
Wow. Yeah. And she chose the hardest life. Like in this life, obviously, she signed up for something tough. And in the life with Amy, she was the slave girl. And
Mhm.
that she chooses those very, very hard lives.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'm going to look over at your counsel. It was a lot of messages about you can't fix everything in one lifetime. Um, yeah, any one life is not that big of a deal. You're doing great. Um, let go of the outcome, relax. But a lot of you're doing great. You can't do everything. Be happy with what you're doing now.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a lot of that in there, and as you said, because we did this, it was a while ago.
That was a year ago.
Yeah, it's been a year, and I'm still transitioning into the role that I would like to do, but I'm further along than I was, and yeah, there's this. I really feel like, Shane and I and my wife and my other daughter came in on a mission, with things to do. But as you were saying, you have to temper that with the fact that we take on these limitations when we become human. That we can't control everybody. That we can't control things, outside of our control. So it's a really weird situation that we put ourselves into, where we want to still be omnipotent, but we're not anymore. We're not when we're here.
Yeah. Well, and definitely they were saying you're to kind of let go of your regrets that you're doing what you can do, but I feel like you can only kind of push the human race so far, so fast in any given lifetime,
Yeah, yeah.
because of our human limitations. Okay, so I'm looking over. I'm seeing a little bit of comments. So let me check and see. Can you see the comments, Brian?
Yeah,
You,
it's him.
you can
Mhm.
show. Okay, so Beecham Parker, that's my mediumship teacher, by the way. Hi,
Oh, hi.
Beecham. He's the one who did my sessions, and then I trained with him. Yes, a facet of the soul, not the personality, and you'll never get it all done. And then Sarah wrote, I'm glad that you mentioned we can't do everything in one life. I think so many people get rushed thinking they have to do everything right away. And I have often also thought that our soulmates choose to have multiple lifetimes learning about a particular lesson. There's not as big of a rush as humans think. Yeah, I think that's a message for me because I always feel like I have to do everything yesterday.
Yeah, in fact, there's no rush at all. If you think about the fact that we incarnate tens, dozens, hundreds, thousands of times,
Yeah.
there really isn't a rush. And the idea of karma, it's interesting she brings that up, because I'm reading a book right now about near death experiences, and one of the messages is that, I guess, in each lifetime, if you believe in the concept of karma, and that's it's a very misunderstood concept, but we only clear so much in each lifetime. We're not here to. Everybody says, once they find out about this is gonna be my last time here. I'm never
Mhm.
coming back again.
Right.
Probably not. And I've said that myself. I would like for this to be my last time here, but frankly, it's probably not.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing you said, along with we get lots of do overs. They just said, when they said it's a reset, like a video game. And for those of you, again, who haven't had sessions yet, Brian is talking to them and then he's relaying it to me. And
Mhm.
then we're also recording it. And they said, it's just continual. And in fact, I had one person who, when he had his sessions, he felt like he didn't do enough in the last life. And he kept sort of saying that. And the council finally said, I love this. So I'm going to look right at the camera. He said, we don't care how well you do. We just care about you. And he again said, but I don't think, and they said, our answer will always be, you're doing fine. You're doing wonderfully. Like it was almost like, we don't care what you accomplished or didn't accomplish. And this was a pretty young soul. So I think the council was just trying to reassure him. We don't care how well you do. We just care about you.
there's a lot of judgment we put on ourselves, and again, for I speak for myself, coming from a fundamentalist background, when we hear things about life review or we hear about a counsel, we equate it with judgment,
Hmm.
and we think we equate it with the fact that when we die, we're going to be judged by God.
Hmm.
Uh, Everybody that's had a near-death experience has said that's not what it is, and in fact, as you said, it's usually the counsel is comforting us because we're
Right.
judging ourselves because we're still carrying of this idea that humans we have to do big things.
Right.
And the other thing I've learned from studying near death experiences is it's not the big things that really stand out. It's the little things. It's
Right.
smiling at someone. It's saying hello to somebody. It's all the things that we take for granted where we make someone's day or we can actually change someone's life and not even know it. But we say, oh, well, I didn't make enough money or I didn't reach enough people or
Right.
I have my podcast and I'd like to have 100,000 listeners. But if you reach one or two people, you've done a lifetime worth of work.
Yeah. And one of the stories in one of Michael Newton's books, um, the person was a successful CEO of a company and he was really proud of that and he employed a lot of people and he was thinking that's what he would hear about at the council. And instead they brought up this story when he talked to some woman who was, I don't know if she was crying, but something was wrong at a bus stop.
Hmm.
And he was like, well, but I had this big job and I hired all these people and they were like, well, tell us about the woman on the bus stop.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's very different from what we think. Hey, speaking of judgment, I think I asked you a question in the council about how do they feel you did in the last life, which is a real common question.
Hmm.
You, and you corrected me and said, they don't evaluate how I did. They help me evaluate how I did. And if there's anything left over, then I'll work on that in the next life. But there was no like judgment or criticism or life review in any way.
Yeah, I think again, it comes back to the way we're always evaluated here. When you said that, it reminded me of school. You get letter grades. How did you do?
Mhm.
Did you get an A? Did you get a B? And I don't think it's like that. It's like what was your experience and how can you take what you've learned and grow. It's not a pass fail thing. It's not a you did great, so now you get this, and or you didn't do so
Right,
great, so now you got to go back and be like do this.
right,
And that's a very old concept. Again, reminds me of a Bible story when and this is one of the places in the Bible where they refer to reincarnation when the disciples asked Jesus, "Why was the man born
right,
blind?"
right,
And they said, "Who sinned, him or his parents?" And Jesus said, "Neither." That's not why people are born blind.
right, right. Exactly. Um, I think I shared this on your podcast, which is I did have one session. Oh wait, Beach and Parker is saying hello. How much more were you loving in your words, actions, and thoughts towards yourself and others? Yes. Um, I did have it's. I was again. I learned. Sorry, I'm stuttering. It was all love on the other side, and I think I shared. I did have one session where the person, when they crossed over, it initially was not like that. The
Hmm.
guide was actually annoyed with them and said, you wasted that life and we want you to go right back in. And I literally, we have a book with questions to ask at different parts of the session. And I'm like flipping through madly because I was still pretty new to this. And it's like they told me it's always loving and you never go right back into another life. And, um, and they actually went before Mr. Mighty. She's given me permission to share this story, who was the mean supervisor you go to basically when you're in trouble.
Hmm.
And, but even there, he said, I'm sorry I was so hard on you because you're too hard on yourself now. So the ultimate lesson or message was love, but initially it was it was a little bit different. And
Hmm.
so I do think there are different souls at different levels.
Hmm.
And that person's soul group was like a rogue soul group where they were smoking, drinking, hell raising in a pub. It was kind of wild. Oh, and speaking of levels, it's kind of hard for us to understand, especially in our culture. But there's different levels, but there's not a judgment like, oh, you should be here. It's not like the advanced souls are in any way, there's no hierarchy, even though people are at different levels of growth. which I know
Yeah,
is
that's
part of our
my
brain's
understanding.
sense.
And we again, when we think of levels, we think of 1 through 12 or 1 through 7 or whatever the number is. But it's more like, from my understanding, it's more like vibrational resonance. So we go to a place where there's going to be people that we resonate with, and Swedenborg talks about this in his experiences. That, in fact, it's interesting. He says, like, when you first cross over, the angels take you to like a high level, and you'll be uncomfortable there because you're not ready for it yet. And you kind of work your way down till using down, but kind of work your way to where you're most comfortable. And that's kind of where you settle in. But the lesson is, it's not just one place, just like Earth isn't one place. We've
Right.
got Los
Right.
Angeles and New York. We have deserts, we have forests, we have, cold places, hot places. The afterlife is vast. There's lots and lots of there's lots of variety.
So I see a couple people signing off, and I have to confess, I'm not watching the time. Oh, wow. We've been going a long time, Brian. So let me look and see if there was anything else. I just see it's all okay. Be happy. Let go of the outcome. Relax. You're doing a great job. How is it to even hear those messages again?
You can never hear. I can never hear them too much. For me, I'm very hard on myself. I judge myself quite a bit. I come from a family with high standards. I mentioned earlier, my grandfather was a pastor, so
Yeah.
he pastored a very large church. So I feel like I want to continue on that legacy. And I've got my daughter pushing me too, because Shayna's, I think she's still here, still cheering me on. But the lesson I got from it is it's all going to be okay. And that's the lesson that we hear over and over and over again
Right.
from every message we get from the other side.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Well, thank you very much for being here. I want to just look at a couple more things before we go. Brian has a 30-minute free consultation for anybody who is interested. And Leticia, my assistant, will post the link in the comment section. He also has a new free, very generous mini course. I want to say it right. Putting the pause on people pleasing. There's a lot of P's in that.
Yes. Yeah. It's a lot of alliteration. Yes.
Yes. Okay. And they can also get the link from that in the comment section. And I just want to look. I have my little notes taped above me here. Next week, we'll be talking about frequently asked questions like, am I making it all up? And can I be hypnotized? And things like that. And then in 2 weeks, we'll have on the gentleman who was looking up things about a session. So before we go, let me look and see if we have any questions. Oh, there's the comments. Thank you to both of you. Bless you. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. And let me just look. Oh, and we do have, I forgot to say this in the beginning, we do have some gift bag giveaways for those of you who comment and ask questions. Oh, I think there's a message from my assistant. I think she's probably reminding me that. Don't forget about the bag. So put your, let's see, send Leticia. Leticia will put her email. I'm trying to remember how we do this in the comment section. And then you can send her your address if you are one of the people who commented or asked a question this week. And we will be sending those to you. So I think that is it. I just want to make sure and mention your things next week. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And it's a pleasure, Brian. It's great
Good
to
seeing
see
you,
you.
Vondi. Thanks for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for being here with us and our very first special guest with very special Brian Smith. See you next time.
Thank you for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow. Join us next week for another episode of Soul Guide.